The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Developing Emotionally Effective Leaders. We will be getting started shortly, but first I wanted to take a minute to go over the format of today's webinar. If you are attending this webinar for CPE credit, you must answer the polling questions that are presented throughout the webinar, along with completing the post-webinar evaluation that will be sent out with the recording and slides tomorrow morning. All phones have been placed on mute for this webinar. If you have any questions throughout, please use the Questions tab in the menu. We will address questions at the end of the webinar as time permits. And if time does expire, we will follow up with you following the webinar and your question. We will also be recording this session, and the recording will be sent out tomorrow morning. Again, thank you for joining us. At this point, I would like to introduce our presenter. Frank Levesque is a director with Bloom's Human Resources Consulting practice, providing HR and people strategies and solutions for clients throughout Massachusetts and New England. As a senior certified professional in human resources, SHRM-SCP, and certified emotional intelligence EQI 2.0 trainer and coach. Frank brings expertise and best practices from 25 plus years of HR business partner leadership and consulting experience across a wide variety of industries and organizations, from small family-owned businesses to large global corporations. I'll now hand it over to Frank to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Jared, and good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Frank Levesque, and I'm really happy to be here today. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, and one that I have a lot of interest in and a lot of passion for. And I think, I'd like to be able to just kind of explain, how it is I learned and got into, if you will, learned about and got into emotional intelligence. And in my years of HR, as many of you, I'm sure, have also encountered, I've seen time and again that otherwise talented, smart employees, very educated, even high performers, are tripped up by these blind spots. And oftentimes, in my experience as well, HR professionals being tripped up by these blind spots in emotional intelligence, which for me over the years was frustrating because I just didn't see the solutions in a targeted way that would address those areas that time and again seem to be challenges for folks. Certainly, especially with high performers, they were getting results. And let's face it, this is about getting results. But how did they get there? In my experience, I've seen, very high performers who are also burning out their teams. They're running over colleagues. They're kind of leading by a do it or else mentality. But they're burning bridges. They're not able to build relationships. And ultimately, these are issues that show up in poor retention, turnover, engagement scores that are on the low end, and productivity. So the more I began to explore the world of emotional intelligence, or EQ, as I will refer to it as, you may also hear EI. EQ just happens to be my preference. But the more I began to explore the world of emotional intelligence, the more that I realized that this was a missing piece for a lot of organizations and curriculums, including in my own organizations. And I also began to see that this was not just about being a people person or having soft skills, that this was backed by science and research. And one of the early pieces of information that I came across, which was telling for me, was from the Center for Creative Leadership, that 75% of careers are derailed for reasons related to emotional competencies, including the inability to handle interpersonal problems, unsatisfactory team leadership during times of conflict, and an inability to adapt, change, or elicit trust. And so this is why I got into emotional intelligence. This is why I'm passionate about it. It is, for me, a critical skill, and one that I think at this juncture is certainly gaining the traction I think that's been warranted for some time. What we'd like to do is start in with our first poll question of the day, and I would ask that you participate today only because I find that these webinars and these learning opportunities are most impactful when we have participation. And our first question of the day is emotional intelligence already recognized in your organization as a core competency in your talent management strategy? And by recognized, I mean, is it formally declared as a consideration, whether it's in your hiring process or in your learning and development efforts? And I'll just give you about 20, 30 seconds to answer that.
Again, if you're attending this webinar for CPE credit, you must answer all of the polling questions, and this is the first one.
Thank you, Jared. And this will also provide some interesting data on where each of you are at relative to other organizations in terms of bringing EQ to your organization. Okay, so not surprisingly, at least half, if not more, do not have emotional intelligence as what I call sort of a standalone part of your learning and development efforts or your talent management strategy, and 30% are unsure. So that certainly also speaks to the tremendous interest we had in this webinar today, and hopefully by the end of our time together, we will allow you to leave here with some more knowledge and some tools that will allow you to go back to your organization and start to consider whether EQ should be part of those efforts. I'd like to also start with a quick story to sort of illustrate EQ in action, if you will, or lack of EQ. But imagine the following scenario. You're hiring a new member of your executive team. The candidate across the interview table has impeccable credentials, an MBA, professional certifications, and a decade of relevant industry experience, and a track record of, quote, getting it done. During the extensive interview process, the candidate demonstrates clear examples of strong business acumen and strategic thinking. He's checked the box on almost every hard skill qualification you're looking for. However, if there's a red flag, it's that based on your own observations and feedback from others, that the candidate may have come on a little strong in describing his accomplishments. He also interrupted the interviewers on a few occasions. One interviewer in particular remarked, "I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something there that just doesn't feel right." Regardless, you quickly dismiss this as a non-issue because the position requires results, tangible results, in a relatively short period of time. And based on the alignment of their experience and what the key competencies for the role are, they certainly appear to fit that mold. However, within the first 90 days, the honeymoon appears to be over. Despite an initial affirmation of the strong technical skills and knowledge you knew that he brought to the table, concern about the candidate's communication style and his overall approach with people were being brought to your attention directly and indirectly from every direction. Employees, his own team, his peers describe your, quote, rock star as self-aggrandizing, interested in talking more than listening, and unable or unwilling to properly read people and situations, all the while seemingly unaware of these shortcomings. As a result, your new executive hire has been unable to gain any traction within the organization and building important relationships, and moreover, he hasn't been able to establish any credibility. You fast forward another month, things have not gotten better, and despite repeated conversations with your new executive hire, you eventually make the difficult and very costly decision to terminate his employment. As you get back to your desk, you prepare for the time-consuming process of finding a replacement, and it becomes clear to you that something has to change in your process. Business acumen, strategic abilities, and a seat at the table are simply a ticket to the dance. You decide that your focus must be on the often maligned but underestimated soft skills, areas of self-awareness, empathy, building relationships, and what you're really focusing on is the critical competency of emotional intelligence. Now, I tell you this story as a real-life example, one that I encountered myself, and one that provided even more inspiration, if you will, for me to look into emotional intelligence, research it, and also write an article for Talent Economy magazine in October 2017, which this is excerpted from. So our agenda today, we'll look at what our goals are for today and the time that we have. We have about 50 minutes to get through a lot of information and leave room for questions and answers, with the understanding that this is a topic. I've done quarter-day workshops, half-day workshops. We can even do full-day workshops that cover a lot of ground. But with the time we have today, I want to make sure we hit on these important points. The typical or traditional models and styles of leadership effectiveness. Certainly, I don't want to assume that everyone knows what emotional intelligence is, so I want to make sure we cover that. We'll talk a little bit about the EQI 2.0 model of emotional intelligence. That is an assessment and a model that we use with our clients and have done very successfully, but understand that it's one of many that are out there. It just happens to be the one that we use and have found successful. And then, of course, incorporating EQ into your own leadership development efforts and perhaps that of your teams. We're not going to do any deep dives here on leadership models and styles, but to really just kind of acknowledge what it is that's more common, what's been out there, and what particular model that we find maps very well with emotional intelligence. So our goals for today are pretty straightforward. We want to examine the traditional as well as your own, I guess, personal views and experiences on what it is that makes a great leader. What are the characteristics of great leaders? And then we'll explore emotional intelligence as it relates to leadership, and then talk about strategies for EQ development and related activities. Our goal for this section on leadership effectiveness is to look at our understanding of the characteristics of great leaders, both from what we already have learned over the years through schooling and also through our own experiences. Now, it's no secret that there's also no shortage of options out there when it comes to different styles and philosophies on leadership. This is a slide that points out some of the perhaps more well-known books that are out there and some of the assessments that are out there, including Hogan, Predictive Index, Caliper, Myers-Briggs. These are books and assessments, again, that you may be very familiar with, but the point here is that there is no shortage of options out there, and it's not our goal today to try and convince you that one is better than the other, but to simply make the point that the options are limitless. And in fact, if you were to search for leadership books on Amazon, you'll find over 60,000 results. And if you enter leadership books on Google, you'll get over 20 million results. When it comes to leadership styles, there are many what I would call sort of more commonly known styles, but again, the list is long. They include, and it's not an all-exhaustive list, but and many of which I'm sure you're familiar with, but facilitative, transactional, situational, servant, emerging, charismatic, transformational, bureaucratic, cultural, authoritative, strategic, cross-cultural, democratic, pace-setting. The list is long, and some have more in common with others, and all certainly have their pros and cons. But the fact remains that there are different schools of thought and certainly different views on sort of what is considered, quote, best. Now, while today isn't about which leadership model, book, or assessment is best, we would like to tap into your own experiences. And we're going to ask you, what do you consider to be the characteristics of a great leader in your life, in your experience? And what made that leader, what made him or her a great leader? And we are limited by the number of options that we have for you to answer, but there should be 5 choices. And we just ask that if you think back, or maybe you're currently working for a great leader, what is it about that leader that you feel made them or makes them a great leader?
Again, if you are attending this webinar for CPE credit, you must answer all of the polling questions, and this is the second polling question asked.
Okay, well, the results are in, and not surprisingly, the top choices for characteristics were had my back and good listener. Um, we typically work through this exercise in a classroom environment, and during that exercise, I have folks pair up and talk about this, and then come back with the characteristics that they feel, based on their experience, make up a great leader. And what we do is we make a column on a flip chart of hard skills or technical skills, and then soft skills. And nearly 100% of the time, the column with soft skills or the emotional intelligence skills is the column that has most of the characteristics of great leaders, according to the folks that are in the training. And herein lies a challenge for emotional intelligence. Despite a wealth of research and data to support EQ, it still has the risk of being downplayed as touchy-feely stuff, or more formally, I guess, soft skills. Part of the problem is that many believe that, unlike technical skills, soft skills, or EQ, aren't competency-based and therefore cannot be taught, and EQ is lumped into that same belief. But as we'll see, one of the more compelling reasons for building EQ skills is exactly that unlike personality or even IQ, EQ skills can be improved. We're going to show you a couple of graphics here. They're simple, but they're meant to illustrate a couple of links between leadership and emotional intelligence. Now, in looking at the EQI 2.0, which we'll take a deeper look at in a moment, there were 4 leadership lenses that were identified that most closely aligned with and mapped with or mapped to transformational leadership. So this chart shows on the left-hand side the 4 main components of transformational leadership, which is a very well-known, very popular style of leadership. It's also known as the 4 I's: idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. The 4 key areas on the right are the EQI 2.0 lenses that we look at when it comes to leadership and EQ skills. And they most closely align, again, with transformational leadership and the 4 I's. And so you can see here that the first bar, idealized influence and authenticity, these are leaders that are value-based and walk the talk. The second bar is the insight and inspirational motivation bar, where leaders who are providing insight into clear, practical, and easy to understand visions that individuals and teams can relate to and feel connected to. The third one is the intellectual stimulation and innovation, which is empowering teams to be creative and innovative. The key word being empowered. Teams feel like they have an ability to be part of something important and meaningful and bigger than themselves, and that they're always encouraged to be learning. And then the last one, and I would argue maybe even the most important one, is connecting with people on an individual level, demonstrating a genuine concern for them as individuals, and knowing that the CEO of a 10,000 employee company can't realistically expect to be connected to every individual within their organization at that level. However, if this is woven into the organization, if this is part of their culture, then his leadership team, his managers, the people that are supporting him and managing their teams, if they're subscribing to this approach, they are connecting with their people. And ultimately, these are the things that create trust in the organization, and these are the things that have very direct links to engagement, to productivity, to morale, to performance, etc. Again, a very simple graphic, but one to make a point about core values and beliefs, or as we call them in the context of emotional intelligence, mental models. And I think we can all agree that our core values or our mental models underpin our behaviors. And so you can see here that sitting on top of the core values and beliefs or mental models is emotional intelligence, and at the top are technical skills. And so by technical skills, we mean the skills of leadership, the skills of communication, the skills of change management, conflict management, and project management. Our core values and beliefs, our mental models, affect our ability to be emotionally intelligent, affect our ability to conduct ourselves or exercise behaviors that are emotionally intelligent behaviors that ultimately affect our ability to not only have impact, but be able to perform effectively in the technical skill area. So before we get into an exercise on mental models, this is a nice quote from Henry Ford that says, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you are right. And what we're talking about here are ingrained habits and thought patterns that lead to things like intuition and gut feel, and really it's data that almost like muscle memory. I was going to say I'm a drummer. I'm a former drummer. I don't play as much now, but when I was in a band for many years, as long as I was practicing and I had gigs and we were playing shows, I had muscle memory. It was as if I could go around the kit effortlessly without even thinking about it. And then when I didn't have as many shows and I didn't have as much practice, that became a lot more clunky. The same holds true for mental models. And these mental models are built up by our experiences and become useful tools for us. However, they can be flawed. And so when we're thinking about a new way to lead people, when we're thinking about emotional intelligence, of which a major component of emotional intelligence, I would argue, the immediate sort of first step in emotional intelligence is self-awareness. And these are things that take practice. And sometimes this is going to be more challenging for some than others. And part of what gums things up and gets in the way sometimes are our mental models. So we're going to do a quick exercise to demonstrate what kind of impact these mental models can have on our behaviors and how we lead others. So just in a moment, I'm going to show you a slide, but I'm just going to ask you to make sure that you have a pen or a pencil ready and paper. I'll just give you a few seconds to do that. Have a look at this slide. Now write down as many words as you can recall. I'll give you about 20, 30 seconds to do that. Okay, this leads to our next exercise, our poll question. This is poll question number 3, and the question is, of the words that you wrote down, did you include the word sleep? Yes or no?
Again, if you are attending this webinar for CPE, you must answer all poll questions, and this is our third polling question.
Okay, the results are in, and it was pretty split down the middle. Almost 50% of you said that you did write down the word sleep. You can see here that the word sleep is actually not part of this list of words. Now, why did we do this? Well, it's a fun sort of little exercise to demonstrate how ingrained thought patterns and mental models can impact things. So in order to change our view of how we lead, not to mention build our skills in emotional intelligence, we really need to take that first step of EQ, which is self-awareness, and challenging our assumptions, our thought patterns, and our views. And again, it's a fun way to demonstrate and raise awareness of these habitual patterns of thinking, including about leadership. And I am no scientist. I'm not going to pretend to be a scientist, but I would tell you that the science tells us that there are grooves in our brain, and those grooves are, as they're called, neural networks and neural pathways, develop over time based on our experiences, and they form very useful tools for us so that they're easily retrievable. But these thought patterns, these automatic thoughts, and these habits can be flawed. And if we're going to embrace emotional intelligence as a style of or a way to approach leadership, we need to, for some of us, again, it can be more challenging than others, we need to acknowledge that some of our ingrained habits are often automatic and will also have to change in order for us to set out in that journey. We now move to the main reason, or one of the main reasons, I guess, why we're here today, and that is to understand what EQ is and how we can incorporate EQ into our own development as leaders, but also perhaps the teams that we're leading. Before we decide whether or not to take EQ back to our organizations, though, I think it's important that we also understand what it is, what it's not, and why it's important. So we'll certainly talk about the definition. We'll talk about some of the science behind it, and also a bit of the research behind it. We'll also take a brief look at the EQI 2.0 model and assessment, and finish up with some ways that you can bring EQ skills to your own development as well as that of your organization. Also understand that emotional intelligence is just one of a number of different types of intelligences that are out there. There was an author by the name of Gardner who wrote a book called Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligence, in which he identifies a number of intelligences that include naturalist intelligence, which is nature smart, musical intelligence, which is music smart. The list goes on, but it also includes interpersonal intelligence, or people smarts. So again, just one of a number of different types of intelligence that are out there. I thought it would be helpful to also show you, before we get into the actual definition, just some quotes from some pretty well-known publications and people. This is Fortune magazine, and it's from 20 years ago. And it says that business leaders are no longer being defined by their IQs or even their technical skills. It's their emotional intelligence that makes the difference. Most unsuccessful leaders stumble because of one simple fatal shortcoming. The failure is one of emotional strength. Jack Welch is a name that everybody is familiar with, I'm sure. He basically says, it gets right to the point. No doubt, emotional intelligence is more rare than book smarts, but my experience says it's more important in the making of a leader. You just can't ignore it. Daniel Goleman, who we'll look at a little bit more in a minute, is considered what many call the modern day guru for emotional intelligence. But he makes an important point here, which is, emotional intelligence is not just about being nice or being, a people person. Good emotional intelligence skills allow you to have really tough conversations with people, for example, about some very uncomfortable but necessary truths. And so I think, again, that's an important point, and coming from somebody who certainly knows what he's talking about, and we'll talk about him a little bit more in a second. But as far as a definition of emotional intelligence, other definitions exist. This is the one that was developed by Reuven Bar-On, an Israeli psychologist, and one who had a big part in helping develop the EQI 2.0 model. The principles are all basically the same. So emotional intelligence, the definition that we run with, is a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how we perceive and express ourselves, how we express thoughts, develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, and use that information, which is really data, in an effective and meaningful way. I think we could all agree that these are things that are important, especially in the workplace, in interactions with other people, in building relationships, and those areas that, as I mentioned earlier, we see time and again trip people up. I'm not looking to make this a history lesson today, but I just wanted to kind of point out that emotional intelligence is relatively new in the mainstream, but there were seeds planted even as far back as 1939 with Wechsler's adult intelligence scale, where he mentioned non-intellective factors. And then Peter Salovey and John Mayer of Yale University and UNH, big pioneers in the field, are credited with coining the term, I should say, of emotional intelligence back in 1990. David McClellan, who is a well-known, renowned researcher in human and organizational behavior. As the research and the data began to build and expand in supporting EQ, his study of a global food and beverage company found that when senior managers had a critical mass of EQ, their divisions outperformed yearly earnings goals by 20%. This was a landmark research study. David McClellan was also a chair of the Psychology and Social Relations Department at Harvard for 30 years. And there are a number of research studies that are out there and empirical evidence that demonstrates links like this, and certainly they're not very difficult to find. But this was an important one for sure. And then Daniel Goleman, his seminal book in 1995, Emotional Intelligence, and a few years later, What Makes a Leader, in the Harvard Business Review, is really where emotional intelligence found its way to the mainstream. And Goleman also had his own landmark research study of 200 large global companies that determined in senior leadership positions nearly 90% of the difference in their profiles was attributable to emotional intelligence rather than cognitive abilities. He also created 5 areas of emotional intelligence, that being self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, and social skills. And as I've mentioned, other variations have emerged over the years. Another popular one that you may be familiar with is Emotional Intelligence 2.0, a book authored by Travis Bradberry and Janine Greaves. I first encountered that book at an airport, and I think probably many of you who travel and have gone through airports have probably either walked by it or bought it. It's an easy read. It has some useful tools in it. It's got an assessment as well. And that was one of the pieces of information for me that really got me interested in this as a topic. Travis Bradberry and Janine Greaves, they also divided emotional intelligence into several areas. They had 4 areas that has some overlap with Goleman: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And so for business leaders working on their own professional development or that of others, determining which model, which assessment is best really depends in large part on what your preferences are and what your specific areas of focus are. This is a very simple way to sort of explain the science behind EQ. How EQ works is pretty simple, at least from my perspective. We receive stimuli from our environment, which must then first pass through the limbic system, which is where, based on information it receives, it reacts and emotions are created. This, quote, emotional data is built up over time by our storage of experiences, which then in turn builds our ability to rely on things like intuition, hunches, and gut feel. This all happens before it has a chance to reach the front of the brain, or the neocortex, where reasoning, decision-making, and problem-solving reside. And this is, in many ways, the essence of emotional intelligence, the ability to harness and manage in an appropriate and in a productive way the information we're receiving in the limbic system, and making sure that by the time it has a chance to get to the neocortex and our ability to reason and plan and problem solve, that we've been able to harness those emotions in a healthy way. Don't misunderstand, though. Reacting emotionally has served us well and continues to serve us well in certain situations for hundreds of thousands of years as a survival mechanism. For example, when we're in immediate danger, the limbic brain sends us a warning, sends the body a warning that there's a crisis, and then the body prepares to react. So a very simple way of looking at EQ, but one that I believe makes a lot of sense. So now that we have a bit of an understanding of the definition, the origins, and some of the science, I want to take you quickly through the model, or the one that we use, the EQI 2.0 model of emotional intelligence. And this is not meant to necessarily sell you on this particular model, but to give you some insight into the areas that are considered skill sets within emotional intelligence. If you look at other models, if you look at other assessments, I'm certain you'll find overlap. So this is merely just to give you an example of that. Now, this is also an example of the many assessments that are out there. It's non-exhaustive. Not surprisingly, there are as many differences as there are similarities. For example, the MESCI at the top measures your EQ ability, so it actually tests your emotional intelligence ability in the test, whereas the EQI 2.0 and some other assessments are self-assessments that are pretty accurate and also allow for 360 feedback, and also, as we're talking about today, leadership EQ, and so forth. We can also, the EQI 2.0 can also do the same assessment for teams. So this is the EQI 2.0 model of emotional intelligence. It was the first scientifically validated model. It's the most widely used assessment in the world. And again, many models exist, but this is just one example to show the different areas that would fall under emotional intelligence and that we've used with our clients. So as you can see, and as we go through this, there are 5 what I would call main categories, or as they're called, composites of self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision-making, and stress management, each of which has 3 what we call subscales or subcategories. And so I would ask, as we go through this, make note of any particular areas that might be a challenge for you, for your team, or your organization. And I think that you'll find by doing so, you'll be able to relate a little bit better or more directly to the things that we're talking about as we make our way through the model and finish up later with some strategies and some examples. So the first composite is self-perception, which is the inner self. It's really kind of looking inward. It's about how we respect ourselves and understanding our strengths and weaknesses, and often associated with feelings of strength and confidence. Self-actualization is the pursuit of personally relevant and meaningful objectives. And emotional self-awareness, perhaps the biggie in this particular composite, is recognizing and understanding your own emotions and using those in a healthy and productive way, which leads us to self-perception, which is the action of self-expression, which is the action of one's self-perception. This composite includes emotional expression, assertiveness, which is our ability to communicate feelings, beliefs, and thoughts openly, while also making sure that we are exercising empathy, and independence, being self-directed and being free from emotional dependency on others. And again, I ask that you think about your own workplaces and your teams, and what are some of the real life examples that you can think of either now or perhaps even later that may have been could be tied back to some of these particular categories. Interpersonal relationships, empathy, and social responsibility. This is a big one. This is one where I've found in my experience that a lot of people get tripped up. The ability to develop and maintain healthy relationships. Empathy, if emotional intelligence is known by any one word, it's empathy. And that is a skill that allows you to recognize, understand, and appreciate how other people feel. And social responsibility, which is the willingly contributing to the greater good, to society, to others, all make up the interpersonal composite. Decision making, problem solving as it relates to trying to do that in the heat of the moment where emotions are involved. Reality testing is dealing in reality, being objective or remaining objective while you're making decisions, especially in the heat of the moment, especially where emotions are involved or personal biases are involved. And then impulse control, avoiding rash behaviors and rash decision making. And then lastly, stress management, flexibility, adapting to changing conditions, adapting your emotions, stress tolerance, the ability to cope with stressful or difficult situations, and optimism, or as I might call it, resilience in the face of difficulty or stress. Just a quick peek at the results of this EQI assessment I thought would be helpful. This is the leadership results page for the leadership report in EQI 2.0. And the data behind this, the research behind this involved hundreds of leaders, and your scores are benchmarked against the highest EQ scores of these leaders. And so it's a helpful way to kind of see where you are relative to what would be considered the benchmark, not only for total EQ, but for each of the composites and each of the subscales. And it also is helpful in identifying areas that are considered what are called derailers, or very common, the most common areas where leaders get tripped up as it relates to emotional intelligence. And this ties back a little bit to when we were talking about the 4 lenses that we look at: authenticity, coaching, insight, and innovation, and how it's built on transformational, or it's mapped to transformational leadership. The cool thing about this is that each of these lenses has scores for its for each of the subscales that are associated with that particular lens or category. And so really, really helpful stuff that also allows you to be very targeted in, in develop or in addressing areas for development. So for example, if you have a problem with empathy, because your scores are telling that, it's maybe validated by feedback from others, you can see that that is a very important skill to have as it relates to coaching. And again, at the risk of repeating myself again, this is just one assessment. There are a lot of very good ones out there. This just happens to be the one that we use and have used with our clients. So as we make our way through the home stretch here, I want to talk about some of the strategies and recommendations for improving EQ skills for yourself or leaders within your organization. I mean, with the time we have, it's not all exhaustive, but just give you a little taste of some of the things that you can do in a very inexpensive and probably a very easy way, and hopefully be able to walk away today with something that you can use to at least start exploring this a little bit more for yourself or your organization. So the first step I always recommend is assess your own EQ. Dip your toe in the water and experience it yourself, and share those results either with your manager or a trusted coworker and get their feedback, and then allow that to tell you whether or not this is something that you feel will work for you, will work for your teams, will work for your organization. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of assessments out there, but there are free assessments out there. So for example, early on when I was researching emotional intelligence, I found the Harvard Business Review's Do You Lead with Emotional Intelligence, which was free. So in fact, I'm happy, I think I might have a copy of that somewhere. If someone is interested in having a copy of that, let me know. But there are no shortage of options out there, but I always recommend this as a first step in the process of exploring EQ. Now, you could also introduce EQ as a standalone module as part of your leadership development efforts, and I would also argue that it should be part of any emerging leader or high potential training as well, because it's never too early to start teaching future leaders good habits. And I am starting to see emotional intelligence more and more becoming part of curriculums within organizations, or at least having a presence in and of itself. And I think that many of us have seen EQ in action, but not necessarily in a formal way, in the way of having it on a performance review form, or even as a goal in someone's individual development plan. I need Jared to be more assertive. That would certainly be an EQ skill, but creating a more holistic, structured approach to EQ, if this is something that you find is viable for your organization or for your teams, this is a perfect way to do it. You could also look at it incorporating EQ skills into your interviews, selection, performance, and talent management processes. And, for example, in the interview process, not necessarily to determine if your candidates have strong EQ skills, but ensuring that your interviewers, which a lot of that time are your managers, that they have the EQ skills and that they're able to spot these things and certainly conduct themselves in a way that represents strong EQ skills. You could also do a very simple correlation. If you were to do some, basic assessments and, grab some performance or engagement scores, you could try and create an analysis that for your organization demonstrates whether or not there is a link between strong EQ and the key outcome data that you have in-house. So, for example, again, on the interview process, you could keep an eye on things in a candidate like, is this candidate being non-defensive when we ask tough questions? Are they actively listening before they're responding? Are they just waiting to talk? Are they asking thoughtful and appropriate follow-up questions if they don't understand something? Now, these answers may come out of the interview process, but unless you're deliberate about it, unless you're structured about it, unless you incorporate it into your process, you'll be inconsistent with it. And especially when it comes to hiring for leadership roles, these are the questions that really need to get answered and screened out. And then when it comes to performance, if you're reviewing an employee, for example, does this employee have a history of not being able to regulate their emotions in a healthy and productive way? Even if they're a high performer, is it what they're getting done, or is it also how they're getting it done? And if how they're getting it done is important to you, then these are the things that you absolutely should be looking at. Is this person able to connect with their employees or peers on an individual level? Have they been able to build trust and strong relationships? Or do they have low retention? Do they have poor engagement and morale within their departments? High turnover, et cetera. Is this someone that checks their ego at the door and allows others to have the spotlight? These are all red flags if they're not being done well of someone who has challenges on the emotional intelligence front. And then certainly you could consider just, again, dipping your toe in the water by having an EQ 101 type workshop or a lunch and learn, and just see, how well that resonates within your organization. It can be done very easily, very inexpensively. But of course, we all need to practice and model this behavior, especially if we're going to be an ambassador for emotional intelligence within our organization, if it's something we want to bring to our teams or to our organizations. So make a deliberate daily effort to notice your own emotions and that of others. Don't let it sort of sit in the background like white noise while you're going through your day and encountering challenges and making decisions. Be very deliberate about noticing your emotions and those of others. What is it telling you? Body language, the same thing. Practicing empathy. Being active and present and engaged in your interaction with others. That is all EQ in action. And just remember, these are skills that can be improved. So here's a useful tool. I think it's useful to look at it, an area that may be a challenge for you, where you can kind of hone in on it and ask yourself, what happened? What was I thinking or feeling at the time? What was good or bad about it? Why did it go the way it did? And what would I do differently? So as an example, if I took empathy, what happened? Well, I completely misread how my team was holding up when I assigned them that new project that ultimately fell apart. What was I thinking? Well, I was under pressure. I had to get the project done as soon as possible. I was stressed out. I was going on vacation. What was good or bad about that experience? Well, I was so focused on results, I failed to consider and read the already high stress level of the people that I needed to actually make this happen. And why do you think it went the way it did? Well, I've been skipping my team check-ins, and my team felt that I didn't have their back. What am I going to do differently? I'm going to resume the regular check-ins. I'll take the time, even briefly, to gather input for new projects and assignments. A very simple, deliberately simple, generic example, but I think a useful tool to address an area where maybe you've over or under demonstrated an EQ skill. And understand, too, that EQ skills can be overused. So if you are off the charts on empathy, that probably means that you're not making decisions. You're getting stuck in, deciding sort of which way to go. You're allowing other people to have their needs met at the expense of what you need to get done. So it's important to know that you might have a great score off the charts in a particular EQ skill, but they can be overused. And I won't read through this, but this is just another example of a strategy that we put together for addressing empathy. And these reports that we put together as well are very good about leveraging other skills to develop another skill, and very comprehensive. So I will just wrap up, or start to wrap up here quickly by saying that, if you want to build effective EQ skills for leaders, well, don't wait for them to become leaders before finding out that they have poor habits and EQ skills that are going to derail them. I would say that, the business case, I believe, has been made for emotional intelligence, so we should start early. And I would also argue that this is not just for leaders, this is for all levels. Employees with high IQ are better able to handle tough situations, communicate effectively with colleagues, and ultimately, that all leads to a more positive work experience. Managers who can communicate with employees and handle tough situations smoothly have a much more engaged workforce. And strong emotional intelligence skills are contagious, as are low EQ skills. And low EQ skills manifest themselves in negative ways: conflict, unresolved conflict, inability to manage change, the list goes on and on. So again, it's never too early to get started, and I'll repeat what I said earlier. It's about the kind of culture you want. Is this the kind of culture you want? Or if you have that kind of a culture, making sure that you're reinforcing that, especially as you're bringing people into the organization. So we'll finish up with our last poll question, and that is, if you were to pick one of the areas that we identified of EQ, one of the 5 areas: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision-making, and stress management, where would you see yourself developing, or where do you think there exists a challenge for your team or your organization? Which area would you look to develop? And we're trying to get here as a sense of where most organizations might be encountering the biggest challenges. You'll be able to see that also relative to the other folks on the call. So we'll just give you a few seconds to do that.
And again, if you are attending for CPE, you must answer this poll question.
Just a couple more seconds. Okay, well, it appears that the vast majority of you and your teams are stressed out. I'm just kidding. Well, actually, the highest percentage was stress management. And let's face it, we're all doing more with less. And I'd say that the lines between work and home are blurry, and people are having to manage stress more so than ever. So stress management led the pack, followed by interpersonal and self-expression. So again, this is, I thought, just was an interesting way for each of you to kind of see where others were at, and perhaps give you some meaningful information. So I will, as we are about to wrap up here, take some questions.
So Frank, the first one we've got is, we saw that slide that had the iceberg with EQ and IQ. What's the difference between EQ, IQ, and personality?
Yeah, I mean, that is a question that we get asked a lot. And there is no known connection between IQ and emotional intelligence. You simply can't predict EQ based on how smart you are. Intelligence, traditional intelligence as we know it, is your ability to learn, and it's the same at age 15 as it is at age 50. EQ, or emotional intelligence, on the other hand, is a flexible set of skills. You can acquire them, you can improve them with practice and repetition. And I should also have prefaced all of this by saying, this is not easy, especially for some folks that this does not come naturally to. It takes work, but through practice and repetition, you can get better at emotional intelligence. Some certainly are more naturally emotional intelligent than others, but you can get better at it. Now, personality, it's a stable style that defines each of us. It's our hardwired sort of makeup and preferences, and for example, being an introvert or an extrovert. But like IQ, personality can't be used to predict emotional intelligence, and also like IQ, personality is stable and does not change generally. So, but having said that, they all cover unique ground. They're all important pieces that make up who we are. And there are times where we do a personality assessment with an EQ assessment, and they're very complementary in that regard. So,
Frank, based on your experience, how have former managers or employees that you've seen exhibited strong EQ, and how so?
I think that the thing that comes out of I would say highly successful EQ managers and leaders is that their workforce feels like that they're understood, and that they would go through a wall for that person, and you just don't get there accidentally. You get there by being connected to people. You get there by being clear about what your vision is. You get there by being authentic, and those over time sort of multiply in a way that creates a team that is engaged, and a team that feels like they're connected to something bigger. And so, while certainly every leader has their own style, I would say that in my experience, those are the things that resonate with people the most. Because if you don't do those, I've seen the manifestation of that as well.
Frank, if an EQ initiative is new to your organization, who's the best person to lead that? Is it HR, someone else? Who should be leading that initiative?
Yeah, so I would say I think it starts with somebody who really has a great interest in EQ and believes in it. Yeah, I mean, like anything else, you need somebody that will be an ambassador and be able to dig in and understand it enough where they can bring it to the organization in a way that they can make a business case for it, and that it's not sort of just the flavor of the month, that you can ultimately demonstrate that this is something that leads to higher performance, higher productivity, higher engagement scores, lower turnover, etc. And be passionate about it, because it's going to take some time to educate folks and to weave it into an organization. So I would say that it could be HR, it could be L&D, but if you've got L&D and HR in the same organization, they should be partnering on this.
Frank, do you have an example of where EQ was linked to or had a positive correlation to organization performance?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of studies out there. There's a lot of data on that link. One that comes to mind is a company called 6 Seconds, where they were able to demonstrate that the managers in the top 25% of EQ scored higher on the company's performance management system. And that same thing, that same outcome held true with the plants, the divisions that they studied, and their organizational engagement index. And so across the board, even turnover, they had a 63%, I think, reduction in turnover over a 3-year period. This was, I think, done in Europe. But that is one that comes to mind, and certainly there are other examples out there. And if anybody on the call today is interested in any further data or research, just send me an email. I'll be happy to point you in the right direction.
All right, and then we'll go with just one last one here. In terms of interview questions, are EQ type questions better or worse, same as behavioral interview questions?
Well, I think that they both serve a purpose, and I think that through behavioral interviewing, which is, to put it simply, is tell me about a time that you did this or encountered that and how you responded. I think that the two are not mutually exclusive. I think that from behavioral interviewing, I think it's a great question, especially if you already have behavioral interviewing in your repertoire, in interviewing candidates. You may already be getting EQ information. And I think that just sort of being more deliberate about making sure that you get that EQ information through your behavioral interviewing is the way to go. But I think, again, great question and a great way to incorporate EQ into your process. Before we wrap up here, I just want to leave you with a couple of resources, some books and some other resources. These are books that I own, 3 of them anyway. Actually, I don't own all 4 of them. One of them is an audiobook. But Bill George is a professor at Harvard. He runs the Authentic Leadership Program and wrote a book called True North. Highly recommend the program, and the book has a big component in it on emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman, with a couple of other folks, wrote Primal Leadership, Learning to Lead with Emotional Intelligence, and a couple of other books, including Search Inside Yourself, which was written by a former engineer at Google. They actually built an emotional intelligence curriculum at Google that was so successful that this person actually left Google and wrote a book and has been very successful with how they approached it there at Google. Certainly Harvard Business Review, LinkedIn, Inc., Fast Company, they're always on the front edge of emotional intelligence news and trends. And then a couple of websites which are pretty cool, the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations and the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Just, again, a snippet of what's available out there. I would love to talk to anybody about any questions after this call today. Again, this is a labor of love for me. I'm very passionate about it, and I could talk all day about it. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me by email or on LinkedIn, or give me a call, including if you do have a particular area of EQ that you want to talk through. I'm happy to do that, spend a few minutes with you doing so. And then I'll just leave you with this one final thought. Dale Carnegie, I think we're all familiar with who Dale Carnegie is, but remember that when dealing with people, you're not dealing with creatures of logic, but creatures of emotion. And I think you could say it any better than that. So thank you very much. I really appreciate everybody's time today.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Again, the recording and slides will be emailed out tomorrow along with the webinar evaluation. Please complete that. It's a requirement if you are attending for CPE credit. Thank you again for joining us today.